Okay, so this is our next installment of Jewish history, and we were up to last time basically the years, at the turn of the first century, first to second century of the Common Era, and we're talking about the temple and being destroyed and kind of what happens as the after effects of that. We kind of went all the way up to the year 136, dealing with Hadrian and Bar Kokhba and the rebellion and Yavne and all that. And now what we're going to do today, what I decided to do today, is to fast forward basically 1,800 years and tell a story. I think probably a story that's not very well known, but it's deeply personal to me, and I think I want to share with you guys. And it's kind of a untold chapter. It's not an untold chapter in Jewish history. Some parts of it maybe, but it's a very remarkable story. During a very traumatic time period in Jewish history. So I'm going to start by telling the story of my own grandfather and kind of how he survived the war, but then kind of we'll meander off to a different topic. We'll see if it's a nice handoff. So my grandfather was born in 1914. He was born in Berlin, the only child of his parents. His father, very strong personality, but also very kind of the model of what German Jewry looked like at the beginning of the 20th century. Germany was the most assimilated out of all the places. And even on the scale of Western Europe, with France, Germany and Berlin was kind of the epitome of the assimilated Jew. We don't have the kind of Jew that existed then almost doesn't exist now at all. You have Jews that are just not interested, unaffiliated Jews, and you have Jews that are, they're interested. They're Reform Jews, Conservative Jews, Orthodox Jews, whatever, but they're not taking stances for or against any ideology, as opposed to in Germany and France and different parts of the United States as well. At that time, the attitude was there were some traditional Jews, and then there was the new Jew, the assimilated Jew. And, that's why they have some of the synagogues in France in the 19th century that they looked no different than churches. Nothing. You couldn't tell the difference. You walked in and looked like a church, and the rabbis dressed like priests, and the services were on Sundays. Like that's an example because they wanted to assimilate. So that's the kind of environment in the Jewish community that my grandfather was born into. His father was a very accomplished, very educated, very intelligent, kind of like high society in the intelligentsia in Berlin. He was a professor. He spoke 12 languages. Of course, he did. He taught French and English. But I looked him up last night to get the details. He was an author, prolific author. He wrote a book called The History of the Jews in Berlin and in Brandenburg. I don't know what that is, but he was a historian, and he was an autograph collector. He was way ahead of his times. He wrote books about autograph collecting. He collected an enormous, like a fortune worth of autographs and just memorabilia from like the kings and the princes of Bavaria and Germany, and he was just very interesting personality. He wrote I have just a partial list of some of the biographies that he wrote. Filled by the name of Berthold Orbach, who's a German Jewish poet. The Empress Augusta, I don't know who that is. I'm sure look her all. All these people have Wikipedia pages. Ludwig August Feinkel. Moses Montefiore, he's the only one that we probably know. Field Marshal Prince Leopold of Bavaria, and someone by the name of Carmen Silva. Plus 10 or 15 other books. All these books are impossible to find now. I try to find them now. In fact, in 1933, because he was Jewish, despite the fact that he was kind of, part of general German society, he was kicked out of his job. Because he was a professor and he was Jewish. He like Einstein. Einstein was Jewish, but he didn't practice Judaism. He went to shul. Probably never went to shul in his life. He was a German Jew of the early 20th century. And he also was kicked out of his job. So he came to America. Unfortunately, my great-grandfather didn't, but he was kicked out of his job. In fact, in his school in Germany, they put up like a big memorial to him in 2003, kind of talking about his life and kind of what happened when Hitler rose to power, and all Jews that were in positions of authority and teachers, etc., were all fired. Now, so that's that was his dad. My grandfather from day one wanted to learn Torah. Wanted to become a rabbi. From day one, he wanted to become a rabbi. And his mother encouraged it. His father says, "Nah, I don't know, become a rabbi. I don't know, maybe not." So he tells stories that his mother, his mother told him a story that when she brought him to shul first time, he kissed her hands. He was so excited, and he would give like on Saturday afternoons or Friday nights in shul, he would give speeches to his friends. He would like assemble his friends and start giving them like some speech about Judaism, about Torah. From day one, he managed to convince his parents to transfer him to the more traditional Jewish school at the age of 7. So he transferred from the more liberal, that had religion, but religion, kind of watered down, to like the more traditional Jewish school. So his father met a fellow by the name of Rabbi Cohen. Very interesting story. There was a rabbi in town, and he happened to have degrees in French and English. In French and English. So my great grandfather and him met. And they kind of had a bond, and they had a sort of like an affinity for each other because they shared the same there's not the same vocation, but they had the same education. So, and he was the head of the traditional school. Thus, my great grandfather felt comfortable sending his son to that school, to learn a little bit more because he was friendly with the dean, Rabbi Cohen. So that's the basic story of his childhood. Some scant details, like he would go to study on the weekends. Rabbi Cohen would have a group of students. He would bring them into his shul, and he would teach them Mishnah, and would teach them a little bit of halacha. And he said every time his mother dropped him off at school, like every time she would start crying. They said his mother was such a special lady. In fact, he many years later, when he's in Israel, he's writing these amazing books that are literally like generational masterpieces. He writes in the beginning that this is all because the merit of his mother, who later on, unfortunately, she was killed in the Holocaust in Riga in Latvia. So after high school, he went to the rabbinical school in Frankfurt. He was kind of bouncing from he went to yeshiva in Frankfurt. He ended up in yeshiva in Montreux. In Switzerland. He says that Switzerland's he says this place is the nicest place in the world. In fact, I found in one of his later books, this is a book that he had intended to publish only posthumously. This is the book of my grandfather that he wrote on. It's called HaMitzvot HaShkulot, which means the mitzvahs that are equal. What do you mean the mitzvahs that are equal? So he collected from all the corners of the Talmud and the Midrash. There's seven times that the Talmud says that there's a mitzvah which is equal to all the other mitzvahs combined. 7 mitzvahs like that. And obviously we know, when we studied the first word of Talmud, there's no such thing as a coincidence, it's all measured. So he said, wait a minute, there must be some pattern here between these mitzvahs. Why are these specific mitzvahs, these 7, considered to be so essential, so crucial, that they're equal to the rest of the mitzvahs combined? So he wrote basically 2 theses on that issue, and he published them. And it kind of incorporates all of his Torah into this very thin volume. But in it, I found, and I actually looked for it last night, I found it no problem, where he writes as follows. I'll quote it to you. A story with a young person whose heart was awake for true faith. He's talking about himself, it's clear. And he came to learn in a yeshiva that was in one of the most beautiful places in the world. He's referring to his time in Switzerland. And he saw the beautiful, just the view. He got so excited. And he said, you know what? This is a place where I could really appreciate the beauty of the Almighty. Look what the Almighty did. He says, I Googled pictures of this place. It's absolutely stunning. Just incredible. And But then it continues. Here he writes about himself. But then, after the time that he was there, he realized that not only did his faith not get strengthened, but rather it got weakened. Why? And he says, only 50 years later did he realize. So 50 years later, we're talking about when he was 75 years old. He remembers that indeed, the handiwork of the Almighty is beautiful. But instead of taking all the beauty in the world and using that as a tool to develop a faith in the Almighty, he, stopped one station too early. And he's like, whoa, what a beautiful world. And he didn't take that last step of, attributing that to the Almighty. So instead of deepening his bond with the Almighty, he deepened his bond with the world, with the physical world, which is the antithesis of the Almighty, of the spiritual world. So that's a kind of a little anecdote that I found from his time in Switzerland. But in there, he met someone who changed his life. There was a fellow who was like a traveling yeshiva student who was a veteran of some of the great yeshivas in Lithuania and Poland. This guy settled down in this yeshiva for a couple. He must have been an older fellow. Older relative, obviously, but older, and he kind of was disenchanted with his yeshiva, so he had transferred and he wanted to get maybe a fresh start in life. So that's one person that showed up there. Another person that showed up there was a fellow by the name of Rabbi Bodnik, who came and delivered 2 Musar speeches. And we know about Musar. Musar is about self-improvement and character development and ethical refinement. So this guy came in there and gave a schmooze. What's a schmooze? Schmooze in English. Right, but this is a serious talk, and my grandfather was shell-shocked. In his life, he had never heard such words, such piercing words of Musar. So he said it changed his life, and he got so excited. He went to his friend, and he said to him, "Let's review the speech." And they reviewed the speech, and then the guy gave another speech, Rabbi Bodnik, and he's like, he freaked out, and so he told, so this fellow told him, by the way, you should know, if you really love these speeches so much, you should go to Mir. You should go to Mir. What's Mir? Mir is a little town in Poland. Right now it's in Belarus. Just that these the neighborhoods change every half hour in Europe. Right now it's in a town in Belarus, which is it's kind of eastern Poland, kind of like southeastern Poland. So he said you should go to Mir. What's in Mir? In Mir, there's the famed Rabbi Yerucham, who gives the best Musar speeches ever. And if you like this, you'll just go insane. He says, there's no greater pleasure in the world than to hear Rabbi Yerucham give a speech. And then my grandfather writes in his autobiographical account that I had to siphon off my father and copy furtively, clandestinely in Staples. And then I bound and I hid and I brought with me back to Houston. I found that he writes in brackets. And in the end, I found that it was true. There's no greater pleasure than hearing Rabbi Yerucham give a speech. But to tell some German rabbinical student, that you're going to leave Switzerland, which is right next to Germany, and go to Poland, backward Poland. It's like sending someone to Nicaragua. I want you to go to Nicaragua and just go live in a tent, without any running water. Like that was the equivalent. And his parents would never, ever approve of him going to the Mir. Never. But the guy said, just go. Just send your parents a letter. Send your parents a letter and hear what they say. Tell me in a letter you want to go to Mir Yeshiva in Poland. So he said, what are you going to do? And he said, okay, fine. He wrote his parents. I'll send him. And they'll say for sure, say no. There's no university there. There's no hope for education. It's Poland. No way. He sent them a letter anyhow. They were at that time traveling. His parents were traveling. We're talking about the year 1934 or 33. At the end of 33, beginning of 34. He writes his parents a letter, and lo and behold, he gets the letter back. Go to Mir. Go to Poland. And he couldn't believe it. He was shocked, but he picked his bags up and packed off to Poland and went to the Mir, which is basically the Mir Yeshiva, and the story about that yeshiva is the topic of what I wanted to talk about today. Later on, his mother told him, listen to the story, guys. Listen to this. He knew his father. He knew his father very well. He knew his father would never let him go to Poland in a place where there's no university, there's no hope for getting any sort of education. Kind of, this is a man probably with degrees to the wazoo. And to him, his son is going to go to this Pole. His parents, his father, had a fellow in Germany that he used to go visit with him. It seems like it was a fortune teller, some guy with the sixth sense. And he went to him and he said, "We're about to travel in Italy. We're going to Rome. What's going to be? Give me some insight." So the guy tells him, "You should know that when you're on your trip to Italy, your son's going to send you a letter with a strange request. You should grant him that request. It's for his best interest." That's what the fortune teller told him. He heard this, my grandfather heard from his mother. And then they're in Italy and they get a letter. Can we go to Poland? So then he takes the letter and shows it to his wife. He says, "Oh, here's the letter. The letter came." So he, against his better judgment, he said, "Go to Poland." This is the only reason why I'm around today, by the way. If he had decided to not, I wouldn't be here. This is, which will be a pattern, by the way, throughout the course of our talk today. So he picked up his badge and went to me in 1934. Remember, this is already at a time where the Nuremberg laws are in the corner. It's not a place from, he was considered going back to Berlin. And one of the worst decisions you could possibly ever make is to go back to Berlin in 1934, much less in 1938, which will kind of retrace the story again, where he's going to be placed between a rock and a hard place in 1938 as well. But when he writes this in his little diary that I found clandestinely, he points out, listen, how many different things had to happen for me to end up where I am. I had to end up in Switzerland. How I ended up there is also a story. This fellow Rabbi Cohn came, this other guy came to give speeches, the fortune teller, all of this had to happen. Any one of those links were missing, he wouldn't have ended up in the Mir. He arrives in the Mir. The Mir is, till this day, the international yeshiva. It was founded 200 years from now, 20 years ago. In the year 1815, it was founded. So it's the longest, continually, currently active yeshiva. It's, has been around for the longest.
Destroyed or nothing, huh?
We'll get to what happened. It's incredible. Today, there's about 6,000 to 7,000 students in the yeshiva in Israel, and they have other branches as well. We'll get to all the details in a second. Founded in Mir in Poland in 1815, and was reestablished in Israel after the war. But we'll talk about what happened during the war, because this yeshiva was the only yeshiva that continued uninterrupted throughout the entire war. That's really the content of this discussion. It was the only one out of the hundreds of yeshivas that existed in Europe. This was the only one that remained intact as a group and survived the war together, and didn't take a day off. And how that happened, it's just crazy. But what was the Mir like? So I think you give a few anecdotes here. What was it like? This is the Harvard of the yeshiva. What does the Harvard of the yeshiva world look like? My grandfather used to say, he says, when you walked in, you saw 400 students, and they're all studying. And if you would walk up and down the aisles, just up and down the aisle between the students, no one will lift their head. No one will lift their head. It didn't matter. Nothing. No one will lift their head. Who's going on? Just, they were there 4, 5, 6 hours straight, studying nonstop. There are even anecdotes of people studying with someone and not even knowing their names. Because all you did was study. All you did was dive into the depths of the Talmud. That's all you did. You didn't sit and schmooze. Hey, where you from? How you doing? You would just study. That's all you would do. Just tremendous, tenacity that they had in this yeshiva. My grandma tells a story that he was once studying with his chavrusa, and someone started running through the study hall. So the guy closed his Gemara and says, "There's a fire. There's a fire." Why? Because in the town of Mir, the small little town in Poland, who didn't have their own firefighters, the yeshiva boys, they were young, able-bodied men, and they were the firefighters. And they knew that no one would ever run in the base medrash. No one would ever run in the study hall. If someone ran, it must be that there's a fire. There's no other reason why. He wasn't screaming fire, fire. They just saw someone running. Someone closed the Gemara. It must be there's a fire. There's no other reason why someone would run there. It's you see someone running? There's a fire. They all picked up the clothes of the Gemara, went to extinguish the fire, and went back. It's a nice little story. Another story here is that, which digs in a little bit in kind of the Musar philosophy. There were two kinds of lectures in every yeshiva. To this day, there's two kinds of lectures. There's a Talmud lecture, and then there's a Musar lecture. Musar is more about perfecting yourself, and Talmud is more studying text. Studying the wonderful oceans of Talmud. So my grandfather had the option, or he really only had the option to write down, to record, to commit to paper one of those speeches, either the Talmud speeches or the Musar speeches. So which one were you going to do? So what does a Musar person do? What's the Musar attitude of making such a decision? Which one do you want to do more? And then do the opposite. Right? That's what Musar's all. It's all about self-denial to embolden yourself. Like we told the story a few times about Rabbi's Israel Salanter and the cigarette. What should I walk and get the cigarette or not? Either way, I'm giving into something. You're supposed to. If you do against what you want, so to speak, then you empower yourself. So he said, I want to write down the Musar lectures. Instead, I'm going to write down the Talmud lectures. A little insight into the into the way the attitude that prevailed. So you remained there for 4 years. It became a different person. Even though halfway through that period, Rabbi Rucham died, the great Musar master. He didn't cease delving into his works, and he was such an important figure in his life that till his dying day, he was kind of existing and living in his presence, so to speak. In 1937, my grandfather had an idea to open up a yeshiva in Copenhagen, in Denmark, with his friend. So their plan was, he wanted to let his wings kind of fly. He was 20, 23, 24 years old. A tremendous genius. Someone with incredible capabilities, as is demonstrated by his later achievements. And he wanted to open a yeshiva in Copenhagen. That was his idea. Even though Copenhagen was a relatively small Jewish community, that's where he thought he would have maximum impact. They sent a letter to the Rabbi Jacobson, who was the chief rabbi of Copenhagen, and said, "Listen, him and his friend, we want to open a yeshiva. Can we meet? He said, "Sure. I'm actually traveling. I'll be in Mir in the summer." A few weeks before they're supposed to meet, he sent him a letter. By the way, I'm not going to be in Mir. I'm going to be in a different city. So eventually, they met him in a different city. No one knew about this meeting. There's only one person who knew about that. So he had a meeting with the chief rabbi of Copenhagen, and they decided to plan this yeshiva in Copenhagen. Only one person knew about that meeting. The only one person that was not part of that meeting. And then he says, it's a fellow by the name of Zev Guthold. I know the details, everyone's names here. Now, this fellow, Zev Guthold, was from Hamburg. He traveled, and he ended up in Stockholm. And he happened to spend Shabbos in Stockholm the same week that the chief rabbi of Copenhagen was in Stockholm. So on the same table, same Shabbos table, you have the one guy in the Mir that happened to have known about my grandfather's plans of opening a yeshiva in Copenhagen, and the chief rabbi of Copenhagen. So they both knew everything that happened, and they're sitting by someone's house. One of the few religious Jews in Stockholm, in Sweden, whose name was Lehman. And as they're sitting here, he has the rabbi of Copenhagen, a yeshiva student from the Mir, and the fellow Lehman tells them, "Listen, I have a son here. It's my young son Eric, and he has no Jewish education. Do you know of someone that maybe we could bring here to teach him?" So both of them said, "What about Wolbe? What about Wolbe? Maybe he's the right guy." Because they both knew that he was looking for something. They said, it's probably not going to work out in Copenhagen. That might not work out. If that doesn't work out, let him come here, and he'll be in Stockholm. That was the idea. So they sent my grandfather a letter. You have a job here. Come. You'll be a teacher in Stockholm, and you'll tutor this boy. And you can open up whatever you want to do. You could do over here. concurrently, so you get this idea, who wants to go to Stockholm and tutor someone? Or Stockholm Sweden was bereft of almost any semblance of Judaism. It was empty. There was nothing going on there, even less than Copenhagen. What are you going to do? You have this offer. Okay, so he put it on hold. Anyhow, it's 1938 here, so he ends up in Germany. He went to visit his mother. He left Poland, went to Germany, went to Berlin, visit his mother. He tries to go back and say, "Oh, you're a German national. It's 1938. We're not giving you a visa. We're not giving you a visa." Why? Because it's Germany. Hitler was inciting all the it was warmongering. They said, "You're German. We're not letting you in." He did everything they can, try to get a visa. Couldn't get a visa. Finally, got a 3-month visa. And after 3 months, they said he couldn't renew his visa, and he was literally stuck. He was in Poland. They said, you have to leave Poland because your visa expires. And he had no place to go. Where's he going to go? So he tried to get a visa. They tried everything, like literally. They tried Herculean efforts were made to try to get him a visa to go into Lithuania, neighboring Lithuania, to go to yeshiva there. He was planning, he ended up in Riga, bouncing around from place to place. Eventually he said, you know what, I'll just take this job in Stockholm. And even though at the time he's like, I have the opportunity to go to this great yeshiva in Lithuania, I'll go to Stockholm, what am I going to do in Stockholm? The Almighty was running the show. It's very clear in hindsight, because during his 8 years that he spent in Sweden, obviously he was safe from the war that erupted in Europe, but also he managed to literally save hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of Jews from the gas chambers. So we'll get to the details of that story as well. So in the spring of 1938, he had already received his rabbinic ordination. He is 24 years old. He doesn't have a visa. He's German. He is absolutely not going back to Berlin. He makes his way to Stockholm, where he's going to settle down for 8 years, it turns out. Let's move this discussion a little bit and kind of talk about someone else, a different figure. That is Chaya, my wife's grandfather. His name is Aron Florans. Chaya is a name Florans. So we talked about my father's father, now we're talking about my wife's father's father. He grew up in a town in Belarus, also right near that, called Baranovich. And he is one of the very, very, very few survivors of that town. It was a city basically that was ping-ponging back between control of the Russians, of the Soviets, and Poland. Of the Jews of the town, less than 2% survived the war. Chaya's my grandfather-in-law was one of 10 children. He had one sister that left to Palestine in 1936, so she survived, but the rest of them were all slaughtered. His parents, everyone he knew in town, they were all killed. So he had 8 siblings that were killed, plus his parents, plus probably everyone he knew. Less than 2% survived. He, in 1938, he also went to the very same yeshiva. He's 5 years younger than my grandfather, so he was about 19 years old. And in 1938, he made his way to this Mir Yeshiva. This decision that he made to join the yeshiva saved his life, as we'll see. Now, very quickly, or very soon after he arrived, the war started. Remember, the war started in 1939. But before the war started, the famous or infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, the non-aggression pact, was signed. That decision basically sealed the fate of all of Polish Jewry, all 3 million people that were slaughtered of Poland. That basically gave Hitler the Eastern Bloc was uncontested. It was an agreement between the enemies, Russia and Germany, that they agreed that let's take Poland and let's split it halfway down the middle. The Germans will take the eastern half. The western half. Right. So this is Germany. This is Russia. Poland's right in the middle. Let's split Poland down the middle. We'll take the western half. You guys take the eastern half. that was the agreement, basically. And that's what happened. It was September 1st, 1939. The Germans just rolled in to Poland on one side, the Soviets team on the other side, and Poland very, very swiftly was parceled up into these two mega powers. Now, in September 17th, the town of Mir, with the yeshiva of Mir, with Chaya's grandfather, came under Soviet control. So this is, a very good thing that actually happened. All things being equal, well, this maybe is debatable, but all things being equal, you'd probably rather be under Soviet control than under German control. Either one's miserable. To have you try to operate yeshiva in Soviet Russia, they won't let you do that. They don't believe in religion. They don't believe in any of that. So the continued existence of the yeshiva under the Soviets was an impossibility. Of course, if you were under the Germans, then you had much more to worry about, as we all know. So September 17th, the town of Mir comes under Soviet rule, and in early October, so a few weeks later, one of the yeshiva students has a radio. And remember, the Mir is an international yeshiva, so there's Americans, and my grandfather was German, even though a lot of Polish students, but students from everywhere. And this guy has the radio, and he hears on the radio a broadcast from England. And the broadcast from England says that the town of Vilna, another town, is going to be given to Lithuania. And therefore, the town of Vilna could potentially be a place that they could run to. The idea being that part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the non-aggression, Soviet-German non-aggression treaty, was that they were going to take the town of Vilna. Vilna, by the way, was a town that was a city that was fought over between the Poles and the Lithuanians. When Lithuania and Poland were both founded at the end of World War I, the town of Vilna was given to the Lithuanians. That was their capital. A year later, the Poles marched in and captured it. So therefore, the town of Poland, the town of Lithuania, the city of Poland, the country of Poland, the country of Lithuania, they broke off all diplomatic ties. Even though they were neighbors, they're right next to each other, they had no relationship with each other, which is to be crucial because in Lithuania, there's not going to be any embassies or any councils or anything like that. None of that of Polish councils and vice versa. So the town of Vilna, according to this Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, is going to be given to the Lithuanians, that they're going to remain independent. So you basically have an option. You're right now in Mir. You're only a few miles, probably tens of miles, but not very far from Vilna. Maybe if you make your way to Vilna, you're able to escape the Soviets and you could continue existing. And Vilna's right now, it's neutral. It's not going to remain neutral for very long. But it's neutral. Maybe this is the place to go. The entire yeshiva, faculty and students, right, they managed to get passports. They got Polish passports, which, by the way, was a problem because in order to travel, you need a passport. And as of October 1939, the country of Poland doesn't exist. Right, half of it's belonged to the Russians, half of it belonged to the Germans. How did they actually get passports? The way they got passports was that the Polish government established a government in exile in England. And therefore, they were able to establish a temporary consulate and issue passports. The whole story how they ended up with the passports. Eventually, all the 400 students of the Mir Yeshiva managed to secure a passport, Polish passport, and make their way into Vilna. Now, the Mir Yeshiva was not the only yeshiva that ended up in Vilna. Many other yeshivas also flocked to Vilna. So you have this little town in Lithuania, right now it's part of the independent Lithuania, that has swelled. We have the details, the numbers of all the different yeshivas, but about 2,500 different yeshiva students from all across Poland and that whole region. They all went to Vilna, but not only that, lots of other refugees, lots of other people living under Soviet Polish control. They also wanted to save their skin, and they made their way to Vilna as well. So for this brief period in time, this one city in Vilna, this one city in Lithuania, just swelled with all these yeshiva students and Jewish refugees. Now, eventually, the authorities in Lithuania, they couldn't handle such overcrowding in this little town. They sent them to different places. So sent them to a city called Kaydin, further east, which is further deeper towards Russia. Eventually, the group, the yeshiva that we're following, the Mir Yeshiva, split into 4 different groups, and the yeshiva kind of coexisted in 4 different neighboring cities. There were 4 cities where all the yeshiva students, because they couldn't fit them all in one city, as refugees, they put them in 4 different cities. Fine. So they're alive, they're well. The war is raging in Poland, and Hitler's moved on to other places already. Right now, they're sort of safe. They're in Lithuania. And Lithuania is independent. And everything's fine, or at least for the moment. What happened was that the Soviet control of Lithuania tightened. And then they demanded new governments, and they demanded new governments, and they eventually what happened was that only a few months after it was granted Vilna, the city of Lithuania became the 16th state in the USSR, in the United Soviet Socialist Republic. So there was this small, brief period in time where Lithuania was an independent country, and a lot of Jews ended up there, but everyone saw that the noose was swiftly tightening. Now, what happened, how are they going to get out of this, right? We're stuck in a corner. What happened was that after Lithuania was admitted, was schlepped in against their will to the Soviet Republic, all the consulates and all the embassies that were in part of those in the Baltic states, in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, they all moved to Moscow. Obviously, because it's part of Russia now, so they all moved to Moscow. But you have a few months in time where there were some foreign governments that existed or that had their embassies in those places in Lithuania. So what happens now is it's just insane. Like, so many different parts have to go right that all exactly did, and that contributed to this wonderful story. You could call it wonderful, but this miraculous story of survival. Now, in order to travel at that time, you had to have at least 3 things. You needed to have a passport, obviously. You don't have a passport, you don't have any ID. Those are your papers. You had to have a visa to the country of your destination. So if you wanted to go, to the United States, you need a visa. Problem is, the United States wasn't giving you any visas. Nothing. You couldn't get any visas, which is one of a very, very shameful time for Jews, while 6 million died, the United States didn't exactly extend their arm out to accept the refugees. Palestine was also a place that people wanted to go. Obviously, it was under the British mandate, and they also sealed their doors to any immigration.
Wasn't that called white paper?
That's the British white paper. That's right. Now, besides for that, you also needed a transit visa. This whole thing, I did so much research on this. It wasn't clear to me because there's so many visas being talked about and do the research. Like, it's so many different visas. You need to have one visa for where you're going, another visa for every place that you're stopping along the way. So if you're going to Australia from Lithuania, you got to have a USSR visa. You might have to have a Korean visa. You might have to any place along the way. You're going to need to have a visa, or else you can't go on the first train. They had passports. If you remember, they got passports in order to get to Vilna, but now they had no visas. They had no destination visas nor transit visas. So there are the story of these 2 wonderful, wonderful people that really contributed to saving thousands upon thousands and thousands of Jews. One of them is the Dutch ambassador. He's a fellow who worked for the Philips company. He was a businessman who happened to be in town, who for a few months was appointed to be ambassador. His name was Jan Zwartindig, something like that. Now he was a fellow who didn't have much of a care for the protocol and wanted to save as many people as he can. So he decided, well, first there was the way it started off, there was one Dutch student who said, listen, I have a Dutch passport. I need a visa to get out of here. So the guy gave him one visa to Curacao. Where's Curacao? Curacao is in the West Indies in Dutch Caribbean. Right. Which is literally the other end of the world. Right. It's an island north of Venezuela. Curacao. So this one yeshiva student said, okay, the Dutch ambassador said, you know what? I'll give you a stamp because you're Dutch. I'll give you a stamp to entry visa to Curacao. The guy walks back to his yeshiva and says, look what I got. I got a Curacao visa, right? Remember, it's still useless because you don't have a transit visa. We'll get to how they got transit visas. And everyone's freaked out. Like, we all have visas. We have 400 students all with visas. The next day, the guy woke up and there were hundreds of people out his door said, "Can you give us visas?" And this guy, and these all had to be handwritten. And in fact, he had to do a little bit of chicanery to get around some of the problems because he had to write on them. Each one of them had to be individually written. No visas required, and he had to cross out certain parts and had to give official stamps. This guy was working day and night. In fact, there's a story that some guy was just there, and like there's such a long line. He climbed up the piping along the side of the building, came through the window, and the guy's like, "Give me a visa." And the guy said, "Okay, sure." He wrote him another visa. He just wrote visas. The estimates are we're talking about thousands of different visas to Curacao. Now remember, these visas are totally useless, because you have to go through the USSR. You have to get a USSR transit visa, and where they ended up going was through Japan. You have to get a Japanese visa. But remember, there's no. Where's the consul? Who's Japanese in town to give me a Japanese visa? We'll get to that in a second. This one Dutch student, by the way, he found, his name is, I have it written down here somewhere. Maybe I don't have it written down. Gutworth, I think his name was. He saw an Oriental person. And he said to him, who are you? It turns out that guy his name is Chiyun Sugihara. And he happened to have been the Japanese consul who was stationed in Lithuania. And he said to him, look, I have this visa, I just don't have a transit visa. So he started writing about this lengthy Japanese, this transit visa, you can get to Japan. Now, once you had the Curacao entry visa plus the Japanese transit visa, the Soviets would give you a transit visa, no problem. Now it seems clear that the reason why the Soviets did it because they wanted this flood of refugees, so they sent their spies. That if you have all these refugees going, then it's indistinguishable who's a spy and who's not. So there were these floods of refugees. They figured we'll give as many. If someone has a transit visa for someplace other than the USSR, we'll give them a USSR transit visa as well. Now, so this guy managed to do it. So what happened? What happened was that from hundreds upon hundreds of people, they went to this guy Jan Zwartendig, and he just wrote them. He made up these visas. It said no visas required, and gave him a stamp. They would run across the street and across the other end of town, and they would get their transit visas to Japan. Now, this guy, we have just the stories about him. It's incredible. Like, he was working 18 to 20 hours a day, just writing visas day and night. The story goes is that he was actually packing up his bags. He's packing up his bags and he was leaving because the consul was being relocated. And the guy, one of the people came to him and started pleading with him, like, "You're our only hope. We're toast. And we know that they would have been toast otherwise." And he agreed, and they just were writing. And also, we know there was an underground as well. There were visas being printed in like these basements, whatever. But remember, your visa is only as good as your passport. A lot of people didn't have passports. Those people were in much worse shape. Yeah, they were Polish passports. Polish passports with Curacao destination visas, with Japanese transit visas, with Soviet transit visas. So this was repeated hundreds and hundreds of times. All the Mir students, they all had their passports, and they eventually, the entire yeshiva managed to get this nice combination of having a having a Curacao visa plus these other transits. Now, in 1986, this guy was honored. You read his whole Wikipedia page. He was honored. Just the amount of dedication this guy had to help these Jews is just remarkable. These two people.
I did some reading one time. This was many years ago. There were a lot of Jews who immigrated to Japan.
Yeah, we'll get to the stories. Yes.
And China as well. It was
China was occupied by Japan as well, which is going to add another wrinkle to the discussion because Japan was at war with the United States, and there were American bombers bombing the place senseless all the time. We'll get to the details of the story here. Now, this guy, he didn't care. This guy, Sugihara, he didn't care if you had a good passport, a valid passport. He had some things that your 3-year-old scribbled on a piece of paper. He was giving, and we have this legend has it that there were trains that were leaving, and he was like writing and just throwing them onto the plane. The Simon Wiesenthal Foundation Center has estimated that Chiyun Sugihara issued transit visas for about 6,000 Jews, and around 40,000 descendants of the Jewish refugees are alive today because of his actions. And my wife is one of them, and my kids are also ones of them. Pretty remarkable.
There's an article in the paper a number of years ago about him. It said that when he got back to Japan, they made him pay for that.
Yeah, he had a hard time. Yes,
Yeah.
He had a hard time. Now, I want to go back to my grandfather. Now he's in Sweden. He established a Vad Hatzalah. Vad Hatzalah means an organization for saving. He was teaching. He had a shul as well. He opened the shul, but he also was the representative of the American efforts to try to save as many Jews as possible. Now, after Lithuania was admitted to the Soviet Union, so this guy, the Japanese guy, packed his bags. He left. The Dutch guy also packed his bags and left. Now, there were many yeshiva students that didn't have passports, so they didn't have the ability to even implement this wonderful workaround to get the visas and all the different visas that were needed. One day, I have a whole article here, amazing article here, written by someone who is a recipient of what happened. So he said that one day they just got a letter in the mail with just hundreds and hundreds of Polish passports. The Polish embassy in Bern in Switzerland. The details are all here. The Polish embassy in Switzerland had someone negotiated and got them passports. But the problem is they had Polish passports, but the visa guy was out of town. He had left. Jan, his name was, I want to say his name because he's a special merit. It's Zwartendijk. He had left, and the other guy had left as well, Sugihara. So they had now the first step that they needed, but they didn't have the rest of it. What actually happened, this is also remarkable, my grandfather in Sweden, he managed to get hundreds of visas for the rest of the yeshiva students from the local Dutch consul in Stockholm. And also to Curacao visas. So they received also they had the passports, but then they received they didn't have a destination visa. My grandfather had hundreds upon hundreds of visas sent. So this guy's right. The guy who wrote this article, he was one of those people who received those visas. Hundreds of Curacao visas from a different Dutch ambassador in Stockholm, and even though then they had the visas, but they didn't have the entry visas because the Japanese guy left as well, Sugihara. So they sent it to Moscow. They sent their passports that they got plus their visas that they got. And they sent them all in the mail to Moscow, to the Japanese consulate in Moscow, and they said they sent it back and they denied them. But eventually they sent it to the Japanese consulate that was in a place called Chida, small little town. And then they received the guy sent them back then with the transit visas. So a lot of those people managed to escape using the same model. but not with the same numbers, obviously. But it's pretty remarkable to think that my grandfather had a hand in directly saving the lives of hundreds and hundreds of people. It's pretty insane. Despite the fact that at that time he was literally starving, he was living in poverty, unimaginable poverty. He was working. He wasn't sleeping for days on end, trying to save as many as he possibly could. So let's go back to the Mir Yeshiva. The Mir Yeshiva, they have this workaround. We're talking about hundreds upon hundreds of students, faculty, families as well. They boarded a trans-Siberian train. This is a train that was built in the 19th century across all of Siberia, so from Poland all the way to the Sea of Japan.
Vladivostok.
Huh? Vladivostok, exactly. That's 100% correct. 5,800 miles in over 10 days. Just remarkable, just traveling through. Some people had questionable passports. Some people had issues. They were praying and studying the entire time on the train, and no one could stop them. No one stopped them, remarkably. People came in, but they never asked them any questions. They managed to land in Vladivostok, which is the Russian port city on all the way on right basically north of North Korea. A little bit north. You have South Korea, North Korea. You have Russia, Vladivostok, and then you have the Sea of Japan to the islands of Japan. They arrived at Vladivostok. They took a ferry, 36-hour ferry. The details of this ferry is incredible. They took a ferry across to Japan. Hundreds. They made multiple rounds. Now the ferry is roofless, no bathrooms, 36 hours. And the Sea of Japan is notorious for being one of the most rocky and just dangerous places to travel. We're talking about they were facing waves 20 to 30 feet high, and they're just exposed, all on the deck. No cabins, no nothing. Traveling with livestock as well. It's just they were just transporting them, smashed like sardines on the boat. Eventually, all of them made it. There was one of them that almost capsized. But eventually the entire yeshiva made it. They made the trek to Kobe, Japan. They landed first in the port of Tsurunga and traveled to Kobe, Japan. And one of these people was my wife's grandfather. Pretty remarkable. It's insane. And they're in Japan. They talking about how beautiful Japan is. It was springtime always. Whenever you're around there, it was just beautiful. Now, at that time, like someone mentioned, it wasn't just the Mir Yeshiva. Mir Yeshiva had traveled in its entirety, but there were other members of other yeshivas, so people that had managed to have passports and used that same workaround. Other refugees as well had joined. They got to Kobe, Japan, and they found a place to settle down. They opened up a yeshiva. They just started learning, just they never stopped. Basically, just continued. Was just transplanted halfway across the world, and they just continued their studies. They had Rabbi Kalmanovich in New York sent them boxes upon boxes of Gemaras, so they had books to learn, and they opened up. They found a building there. We'll talk about the different buildings that they had.
This was in 1941.
1941, exactly. In 1941, early 1941. Now, a lot of them, obviously, at the time. They were early 1941, before the Japanese attack, but we'll get to what happened at that time. Early 1941, a lot of them tried to get visas to the United States. Some individuals did, the United States or Canada, but most people didn't. So they were stuck. They faced major halachic problems as to when where's the international dateline. So we know that the international dateline. Secular dateline is somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. Thus, if you're on one side of the dateline, you're the day before. If you're on the eastern side of the dateline, you're the day before. If you're on the western side of the dateline, you're the day after. So, you could be directly under the sun, and at one point of the dateline, it's Sunday, and the other, if you move a little west, it's Monday afternoon. There has to be a point in time where the day changes. Right where it's under the sun, it's always 12 noon. So when does it change from Sunday to Monday? That's a dateline. But that doesn't help us for the halachic dateline. So when Japan, remember Japan is an island, so it's off the mainland. So huge debates as to whether or not it's considered part of the eastern, the western, where mainland Asia would be? It's the same day as it is in Jerusalem, or is it on, is on the other side? And then what do you do? Is it in the United States? Is it huge debates? Eventually, during that year that they were in Kobe, Japan, they kept they kept 2 days of Shabbos, Saturday and Sunday. They kept. Now, problem was Yom Kippur. What do you do? You can't fast for 48 hours, or can you? There were a few students that fasted the entire way, all 48 hours, but they just stayed comatose in bed. But this was a big problem. There's books written on this particular subject, and specifically talking about this. The entire Mir Yeshiva, they sent telegrams to all the great rabbis. They got different answers, and but eventually followed the opinion of Rabbi Karelitz. He was the number one halachic authority at the time, and he answered the question. But some people just covered all bases and actually fasted for 48 hours. Pretty incredible. So they're in Japan. They established the yeshiva there. They've been there for 5, 6, 7 months. And in August of 1941, Japan has occupied China as well. And Japan used to be the big brother in that relationship. That has changed. And in August of 1941, Japan was very eager to expel them from the Japanese homeland or the mainland, and they sent them to Japanese-controlled Shanghai in China. So Shanghai is all the way in Shanghai is the most populated city in China right now. But it's on the coast. So they all went from Kobe, and to them they were very depressed. They didn't want to leave it. But we'll find out later that once the war started, once they attacked Pearl Harbor, only a few months later, all non-Japanese were put into internment camps and faced torture. It was really not a good place for them to be. So the fact that they were exiled, so to speak, to Shanghai was a very, very good thing for them in retrospect. Now, once the war began, their benefactors that they had in the United States, remember the rabbi who had sent them Gemaras, remember the rabbi who sent them Gemaras in boxes, he had also was sending them money. So how did they exist? They went fundraising in Japan? I don't think so. They had individuals who were raising money for them in the United States. Now, once the war begins between the United States and Japan, you can't send mail from one to the other. They're at war. So what they would do is they would send all the money in massive suitcases to Sweden. Who's in Sweden? My grandfather. He would take off the packaging, take off the U.S. stickering, and repackage it and send it to Switzerland, because Sweden was neutral. So he provided a crucial link between the fundraising efforts on the United States and the yeshiva in Japan and later on in Shanghai. In fact, after the war, he provided a detailed accounting of every single shekel he got. Even though he was living under starvation, literally starvation, he didn't take a single shekel for himself, despite the fact that he had boxes of U.S. dollars.
What kind of money? Oh, U.S.
I think it was U.S. dollars. I assume it was U.S. dollars. Yes, that's the gold standard. And he provided a detailed accounting. In fact, there were other people that were doing this as well, but none of them seemed to have had. Some of the money, was lost to shrinkage. Now, in Shanghai, so what they do in Shanghai? So there was a enormously wealthy Iraqi Jew who, in the late 1920s, had a dream from his dad, who told him, he was a estranged Jew, not so into Judaism, and his father told him, why don't you do something for the Jewish community? So he built an enormous shul in Shanghai. Shanghai was not necessarily the center of Jewish life, as we well know, but the yeshiva arrives in Shanghai, and what do they find? An enormous state-of-the-art building that could fit them all. In fact, I have a picture. I put a picture from the internet, a very famous picture. Here's a picture, I'll pass it around here, of the yeshiva, all 300 students in that building that they had in Shanghai. Just an incredible picture. I should have made more copies of it. Now, and they managed to get stenders. That's also another story. They settled in Shanghai. They had this enormous yeshiva. They just studied, and it's just incredible. And basically created for themselves this little community. They established schools, because there were other refugees as well. Boys' schools, girls' schools, synagogues, mikvahs, everything that you need. In fact, they had published books on Talmud. The yeshiva, it's yeshiva. What happens in yeshiva? They study Talmud. And what happens in great yeshiva? They study Talmud at a very high level. And what happens in Talmud at a very high level? You write Torah insights. So there are books that were published in Shanghai with enormous amount of tremendous Torah insights that were written by the students of Shanghai. Now, in all those books, there's only one person who was published who was actually not in Shanghai. And who's that? That's my grandfather. Here I have it's amazing. This is an actual copy of one of the books that were printed in Shanghai by the Mir Yeshiva. And the author of this is Shlomo Wolbe. It says, Shvedia, in Sweden. Talmid Yeshiva, a student of Yeshivat Mir. Even though he was in Sweden, he heard that they were publishing. And he sent them, I'm joining. I assume he probably just tucked it into one of the suitcases of cash. I assume that's what he did. But they published it even though he wasn't there. And if you look actually, if you were to go through this book and see who are the people that are writing, once the war ended and Torah and the Torah institutions were reestablished, who were the great Torah leaders that kind of resuscitated the religion? Many of them were in Shanghai. And many of the great rabbis were in Shanghai, part of this wonderful institution. And if you open these books, you'll see all their names. Because the Mir was like I said, it's the Harvard of the yeshivas, and the Almighty is kind of like protecting the yeshiva, just providing this cocoon that the yeshiva could just exist in its entirety in the safe or relatively safe shores of just 7,000 miles away from the furnace that's consuming the Jewish people. Now, so it's the details like as to Shanghai was very very hot in the summer, and it was like over 100 degrees in the building. There's pictures of yeshiva students on the rooftop to try to get fresh air. There were people sleeping on this. Well, not the yeshiva students, but like there's stories about them walking up and down and see all the neighbors. Shanghai would just sleep in the streets because that was the coolest place. On the stones, on the stone ground, that was the coolest place. These pictures, like everyone was just sweating so much because it was just so miserable. Whatever. Those are. We have some personal accountings of that story. By the way, many books were written on this subject. Very fascinating. Some of them even in English. Now,
for a minute.
Yes, go ahead.
That building was built before the yeshiva people.
This is built in 1927, I think.
It was sitting there. Was it sitting there empty?
Well, there was.
What did they use?
It was. I don't think it was empty. It wasn't being used. There was a fellow by the name, I don't know his name. He was the local Chabad rabbi. Just like today, we have Chabad rabbis everywhere. There was a local Chabad rabbi who, I guess it was his building. He had control of the building, and he allowed the yeshiva to join, to learn it, to take over the building. It was a very famous picture, and some of these pictures, by the way, they actually have everyone's names in it, or as many people as they can identify. Like you see, like whoa, this person had a yeshiva. This person established an institution. Like it's just incredible. Now, in 1943, they established a ghetto for the Jewish community in Shanghai. So the yeshiva kind of had to leave this building, and they moved to a different building. They were in an old factory that was just falling apart. They had a hotel for a while. They had purchased a hotel with U.S. money, to move the yeshiva to for a little bit. They were in a different synagogue. And what's remarkable is that they seem to constantly be avoiding problems. Like, one of the buildings was hit by an American bomb. Americans were sending hundreds of bomber planes that just bombed the place senseless. And they were in a building, and then they had moved to a different building, the entire yeshiva, and then 2 days later, a bomb had hit the building that they were just in and completely destroyed it to rubble. It's just like, and they managed to constantly be evading the problem, as if the Almighty presented this like bubble wrap around the yeshiva. Not a single yeshiva student died in any way over those 7 years that they were in Japan and in Shanghai. There was blackouts. They were studying by candles, bombs. That didn't matter. They kept on studying Torah. The Talmud says that there always has to be a yeshiva. The Jewish people always have to have a yeshiva. They have to have that. That is the lifeblood of our nation. And even during the darkest chapters of Jewish history, we find this. There's always one, at least a minimum of one institution that's just only dedicated to the craft of Torah study. That's it. There's only one yeshiva that survived the war intact. They managed, to just without losing any students, besides for the ones that had left the yeshiva or had gone away from the group. They had no casualties amongst the group. They survived. Everything went well. And in 1947, they all went on a U.S. Navy ship to San Francisco, and the yeshiva was reestablished in New York. It was one of the major Mir Yeshiva in New York, and in Israel. It was reestablished in Palestine, and it was actually in 1944 because one of the leaders of yeshiva was already there and had already established it. But it's the yeshiva that I studied in. It's the yeshiva that my grandfather would give speeches in, despite the fact that he was not part of the faculty there, but he was presented with the honor of speaking there every week, every other week actually. He would alternate. He would give the Musar lecture, because he was a student of Mir and had done so much to help the yeshiva, through its darkest times, and was just a remarkable scholar and influential Musar personality. And Chai's grandfather, we talked about it. He went through this whole story. His family was decimated in Baranovich. He ended up in Mir 1938. He got the passport. He got the Curacao visas. He got the Japanese transit visas. He got the Soviet transit visas. He took the trans-Siberian train to Vladivostok. He took the ferry to Kobe, well, not to Kobe, to the other place, but ended up in Kobe. He was in Shanghai. He was there, and he moved to the United States, and he passed away last week at the age of 96. And he was one of the last survivors of what's called the Alter Mir, the Old Mir. There's only about 2 or 3 of them left, people that went through Shanghai, and he left. I have details here. He left 7 children, 59 grandchildren, and 30 great-grandchildren. That number, there's several on the way, I know, for sure. Not us, but,
I was getting ready to say something to tell you.
Yeah, no, but others as well.
What a legacy.
Yes. I have here.
What did they get on a Navy ship?
It seems like, I don't know the details. I read that they got it on a Navy ship. So yes, it's pretty remarkable. It's a time in Jewish history that a lot of really terrible things happened. It's a time, we look back and we ask questions, and it's very legitimate. But we see stories of tremendous miracles, just miracles and providence that the Almighty was there for Kai's grandfather, for my grandfather, and just series of miracle after miracle. They just survived. And I wouldn't be here, my kids wouldn't be here, my wife wouldn't be here. None of that would be here if not for all these things falling exactly the way the Almighty intended them to fall. So I think it's an important story for us, and I think it's also it's a lesson. When we talk about Jewish history is Torah. But why is it Torah? It's Torah because it teaches us lessons. The word Torah means instruction. It's a lesson. Lesson for us is on the individual scale, and of course on a communal scale, and a national scale as well, that the Almighty is actively involved in our lives. He's interfering, and He's supervising and guiding. And yes, we have questions. Why did the Almighty allow the Holocaust? That's a very good question. And it's not an easy answer. But it's also important for us to know that the Almighty was there. And for whatever reason, He chose to do what He did. And we could ask questions, and maybe that's a legitimate question to ask. Maybe there could be a discussion that we could have. But for some individuals, the Imani just held their hand and just fended off all the missiles, and fended off the Nazis, and fended off the Soviets, and fended off the Japanese, and fended off all the bombs, and just protected them and guided them. And I feel like I'm a living testament to that. And you talk about, there's more stories. Like I was thinking, if you were to expand this discussion a little bit, how my grandfather met his wife. So he's in Stockholm. She had gone through all the camps. After the war, they had sent 20,000 women, 20,000 Jewish women survivors to Sweden. Right? Sweden says we're accepting 20,000 Jewish female refugees, only female. Why? Because there was a problem. There was too many men in Sweden, and they wanted to have an influx of women. That was the reason why, to help balance that. My grandfather has spent the entire war trying to do as much as he can to save Jewry. He heard a rumor that there's a train full of Jewish girls, survivors of camps. What does he do? He packs his bags. He says, I'm going to go there, see what I can do, and make it help them. Right? He gets there, and he sees just as far as not far that I can see, but he sees just women everywhere, Jewish women, and they're just obviously traumatized and scarred for life, but these are Jewish women from the best Jewish families. Now the whole families are destroyed. Everything's gone. Their life is in shambles, and they're here in Sweden, and with the intent of them marrying Swedish men and disappearing from the Jewish world. So what does he do? What does he say? I'm opening up a school for women. And this is a story in its own right, and there's a book written about this. But my grandfather opened up a school for Jewish women in a place called Lidingö in Sweden. And there were hundreds and hundreds of girls in his school. And he was single at the time. He was 34 years old already at this time. He wasn't 34 quite. He was 31 years old. But he was already he was a very impressive persona. He had a big beard. He looked like a rabbi. He was a rabbi. And he said the story was that he was there and he had brought a sandwich to eat, and he went and he washed his hands and said the blessing, and he turned around and he sees all the girls crying. They had spent 3, 4, 5 years in concentration camps, and they see a rabbi washing his hands and making a blessing, and it suddenly brought them back to their lives with their families. He just shook them up. They all started crying, and he said, "I'm opening up a school," and he opened up a school, and remarkably, he's saved hundreds of women. One of those women was my grandmother. She was there. She was actually an instructor. She was one of the teachers, but she was one of those women who ended up in Sweden. That's how he met. They actually didn't get engaged till they had both gone to Israel in 1947. But she was one of the most prestigious rabbinical families in Europe. But her father was killed in 1944. He was actually burned in a hospital, burned alive. Not all her brothers, but some 3 of her brothers were killed. Her sister was killed. My daughter Miriam is named after her sister. And she was there. She wrote in her book. My grandmother also wrote a story about her survival. She wrote in the book that when after the war, she didn't even remember Ashrei. What's Ashrei? Ashrei is one of the most basic prayers that we say a minimum of twice a day. She couldn't even remember Ashrei. And this is what I'm saying. We're talking about a woman from the most prestigious rabbinical family, or arguably one of the most prestigious families in Europe. Whose father was head of one of the yeshivas. And she, the war just traumatized them to such she couldn't remember how to say Ashrei. That's what she said. But, eventually they, through this school, they rehabilitated hundreds of women. Remarkable stories. That's my grandparents met. How did my parents meet? My father was born in Israel. My mother was born in Brooklyn. There seems to be a lot of space in between. They happen to have met. And I'm thinking, if you think about, I'm thinking personally. I'm just talking to you guys personally. My own life, how many things had to go right for me to even exist? And that's Jewish history. That's what we're supposed to do when we study Jewish history. it's working backwards to see how God arranges things and how makes people meet and makes things happen, and on a communal scale, but even on a personal scale, right? Watching over us, supervising us. When we talked about God, we talked about what it means to believe in the Jewish God means to believe in a creator, sustainer, and supervisor. Supervisor. That last one is what we do when we study Jewish history. When we study Jewish history, it's an exercise in faith in God. Which element? God doing what? God supervising the Jewish people. Is it a rosy story? Absolutely not. But every time in Jewish history, we see a plan. We see how it's part of a big picture. When you have the gift of retrospect, when the Jews were exiled by Nebuchadnezzar, right? For they were the 10,000 of the best and brightest of the Jews were taken and brought to exile in Babylon. The Jewish community in Israel was bereft of their leadership. But the Talmud points out that this is God preparing the antidote before the sickness. This is God saying, I'm going to set up the Jewish community in Babylon before the mass exile of the entire nation to Babylon. Thus, when the temple is destroyed, everyone is sent onto east towards Babylon. They get there. Well, the 10,000 people that were exiled 10 years prior had already established a framework that the Jewish people could continue. That's how we study Jewish history. So, it's a very personal story for me, but I think it's an insight onto Jewish history at large. That the Almighty is watching over us. Why He does what He does is something that we might not necessarily always have the answer for. But we do find remarkable stories, even in the most darkest times, darkest chapters of Jewish history. We find a story like this, where defying all odds, incredible heroism and incredible miracles that ensure the survival of an entire yeshiva intact, that continued studying, continued uninterrupted, and continues to this day. I think it's a remarkable story, and I think it has an important. It should have an important part in our discussion of Jewish history. I want to just read, just to conclude, if I can. We have a hard deadline.
No. Keep going.
This is an introduction to a book called Mivtza Hatalat HaTorah, which is translated in English, which means Operation Saving the Torah, which is a book talked about the story of the Mir Yeshiva. And they asked my grandfather, quite appropriately, to write the introduction, the foreword. This is a translation of what he wrote. A special blessing of Hatov v'Hametiv. There's a blessing where we say about God. God is good and God does good. God's benevolent. Must be recited for the miracles that the Almighty performed for us during the war. We were saved in 1941 together with the Holy Yeshiva from the Valley of Death in Lithuania and Russia and removed to places of safety. This salvation was comprised of an endless chain of open and hidden miracles that is beyond comprehension. We saw with our eyes, we experienced the divine fulfillment of the promise that Torah will not be forgotten from the Jewish people. Those who clung to the yeshiva in its journeys during this time were saved together with it. In this exile of the yeshiva, in these foreign lands, suffering from anxiety and deprivation, the students unceasingly dedicated themselves to their study and thus merited to become the vanguard to spread Torah, raising the honor of Torah and fear of heaven in Israel and the United States. As we mentioned, the students of this remarkable journey are the ones that are going to are some of the people that are going to take very important roles in rebuilding Torah after the Holocaust. In them is the fulfillment of the verse in Genesis, and the remaining camp will survive. The most stunning miracle, greater than all of the other miracles that we experience, and yet it cannot be adequately described, is how each student, deprivation, separation, and loss of family notwithstanding, immerse himself in Torah study, prayer, and musar each day with tremendous dedication. So that's that. I think it's a remarkable story, and one that's probably not as well known, especially in the bigger picture. You talk about the Holocaust; it's just disaster after disaster, But we have this remarkable story, and I think it's an important story. This is the story of God preventing the Jewish people from total annihilation. After the war, if you were to make a prediction, all the yeshivas were destroyed. It was an entire network, hundreds of yeshivas in Europe. They're all gone. They're all gone. There's a few hundred students left. That's it. That's it. We talked about Ben Gurion and his agreement to allow the yeshiva students to avoid army service. That was when we talked about Zionism and religion, kind of the tension that existed. At that time, the sentiment was that the era of yeshiva students, the idea of people dedicating their lives to the teaching, to the spreading of Torah, to the study of Torah, to the intense dedication to the craft that has been the pastime of the people for millennia, that was over. Right? All the yeshivas were gone. Every single one of them, they're gone. The students, they're gone. The faculty, they're gone. Poland is burning. Right? Lithuania is destroyed. Everything's gone. So he said, okay, 400 students, that's all that's left. That'll die out within a couple of decades. What happened? What was the Almighty doing? The Almighty takes this one yeshiva, right? Perhaps the most remarkable one, or one of the most remarkable yeshivas, and just protects it from everything. Takes it across the entire world. It continues existing throughout the war. After the war, Torah flourishes. Torah flourishes in large part due to these students themselves and the institutions that they headed after the war. So that's the story. It's remarkable, and I think it's a special merit that I have and my wife have, that we kind of our parents, our grandparents played a very important role, or they were there. These are the people that we're talking about.
What year did they leave Shanghai?
Some people left earlier, but the entire yeshiva left 1947. They weren't allowed to get...
Any of them still left over there?
No.
I heard there were some.
Oh, maybe, not from the yeshiva, I don't think. Not from the yeshiva. Yeah. So, there are some Jews there. There were some Jews there even before that. Like I said, there was a shul there. But obviously the numbers swelled once all the refugees and yeshiva students came.
Right now?
I don't know. I'm sure there are some Jews there as well.
Question. The Dutch representative and the Japanese representative.
Yes.
Has the state of Israel ever recognized their service?
The state of Israel, I think, has labeled them as righteous of the nations. Yes. They came to Israel. They were honored. Well, one of them, the Dutch representative, he was very mum about it. He didn't talk about it. The other one, he made a book written about them, and they were both honored by Yad Vashem, and they have they both have Wikipedia pages. You can read more details about them.
Was working through them too.
Oh yeah, and it's absolutely. You see this, but it all came together. Passports and all the visas all just converged all at the same time, together with the Malta. It means, ironically, the Malta-Ribbentrop Pact would be very, very crucial to saving the Jewish people. Because that opened the door for that temporary little time period for the Jews to have, or for Lithuania to have sovereignty over Vilna, and to be independent, and that's where they all came to. That's where they all found all the visas and transport visas and entry visas, etc. No one actually made it to Curacao, by the way.
It looked like when they hit a brick wall, there was just no place to go.
Yeah,
a hole opened up.
That's right, and it's
obscure type of thing, seemingly.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what we find in Jewish history. It's like if at each one of these particular miracles on their own merit, you say, well, it can be coincidence. Each one on their own. Well, maybe there was one really nice Dutch ambassador who happened to be there and but then when you just add one after another, you basically see the Almighty's handiwork. That's our job when we study history, to try to see how the Almighty is, manipulating and interfering and guiding, orchestrating. Thank you.
I'm glad we had a Dutch contrarian businessman in the ambassadorship.
That's right. Yes. Anyhow, thank you all for listening. Really appreciate it. We'll see you all next week.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
And next time we talk about Jewish history, it most likely will be going back in time.
How do we look at these stories?
Yeah.
Like this.
If you want, here, I have a copy here. This is one individual's account. I found it online. I can email it to you guys if you want.
Can you email me where I can get it?
Yeah, why don't you do that? I'll just out to the class.
Yeah, I'll email it to Dan and we'll send it out.
Okay. You seem to help a lot of people that way. That was wonderful.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
that
Thank you so
story.
much. Thank you.